The first person who told me I had moved out was my neighbor. I had just returned from the grocery store on a rainy Thursday afternoon, balancing 2 bags against my hip while trying not to drop my keys in the puddles near the driveway. Mrs. Langley stood across the street beside her mailbox wearing a yellow raincoat and staring at me strangely. Not frightened, confused, like she was seeing someone who should not have been there. I smiled politely. Terrible weather today. She did not smile back immediately. Margaret, the hesitation in her voice made my stomach tighten slightly. Yes, I thought you moved, I laughed softly. Unfortunately not, I still have bills to pay here. But Mrs. Langley kept staring at me. No, she said slowly. I mean last week. The moving truck. The grocery bags suddenly felt heavier in my hands. What moving truck? Now she looked uncomfortable. The one your daughter hired. Cold spread slowly through my chest. My daughter, she told everyone you were relocating closer to family. For a moment, I genuinely thought there had been some kind of misunderstanding. A different house, a different daughter. Then Mrs. Langley added quietly, she said your memory was getting worse. The world seemed to narrow around me, rain tapping softly against the pavement. Cars passing somewhere in the distance. My heartbeat slowing strangely, not panic, recognition. I had heard that careful language before. Memory getting worse, not sick, not confused, getting worse. I set the grocery bags down slowly beside the porch steps. What exactly did Laura tell you? Mrs. Langley looked deeply uncomfortable now. Oh, Margaret, I probably shouldn't, please, she hesitated, then quietly. She said you were having trouble living alone after Richard passed. Richard. My husband had been dead nearly 4 years. Grief apparently has no expiration date once people begin using it as evidence. She said you'd already agreed to move into some kind of senior community. Senior community? I stared at my front door. My house stood exactly as it always had. Blue shutters. Rose bushes Richard planted himself. The brass mailbox slightly crooked because he never fixed it properly. No moving truck, no relocation. Yet suddenly I felt like a stranger standing outside my own home. When exactly was this truck here? I asked softly. Last Thursday. I had spent last Thursday at Susan's house 2 towns over helping her sort old family photographs. Gone nearly the entire day. My chest tightened painfully. Did anyone go inside the house, Mrs. Langley nodded slowly. Your daughter and 2 men carried boxes out for hours. Boxes. I suddenly remembered something strange. Saturday morning, I noticed several photo albums missing from the hallway cabinet. At the time I assumed I had misplaced them while cleaning. Now my stomach turned cold. Mrs. Langley lowered her voice slightly. She seemed very stressed. Stressed, interesting, not deceptive, not suspicious, just stressed. Did she say why I was moving? Another hesitation. Then, she said you were starting to forget where you lived sometimes. I nearly laughed, not because it was funny, because the lie was so absurdly specific. I have never forgotten where I live. Mrs. Langley looked relieved, hearing certainty in my voice. For one brief moment, I realized she had not fully believed Laura either. Only enough to become uncertain. And uncertainty is dangerous. Because once doubt enters people's minds about an older person's memory, every ordinary mistake begins looking suspicious. I carried the groceries inside slowly. The house smelled faintly different, not dramatically, just enough. I stopped immediately inside the hallway. The table near the staircase had been moved slightly to the left. Most people would never notice, but Richard measured every piece of furniture obsessively. The placement stayed unchanged for 20 years. I walked carefully through the living room. Bookshelves, curtains, photographs, then my stomach dropped. The framed picture of Richard in his navy uniform was gone from the fireplace mantel. I stood completely still. No, I searched the room quickly. Nothing. Then I noticed something else. Several drawers in Richard's old desk no longer closed properly. Someone had gone through them. Not a burglar. A careful person pretending not to disturb things. I suddenly remembered Laura insisting 3 weeks earlier, you should really start simplifying the house. Simplifying, Another harmless word. At the time, I thought she meant decluttering. Now I wasn't so sure. I called her immediately. She answered cheerfully. Hi, Mom. Normal voice, warm voice. That frightened me instantly. You told the neighborhood I moved. Silence. Not confusion. Silence. Then softly, oh. That tiny word made my blood run cold. You knew. Mom, please don't get upset. Upset, always upset. Never betrayed, never violated. Upset. There was a moving truck at my house. We were organizing things. We, always we, not I. Collective concern always sounds more legitimate. You removed boxes from my home without permission. You said yourself the house was overwhelming lately. I stared around the living room slowly. My husband's photograph is missing. Long silence. Then carefully, it might have been packed accidentally. Packed, not stolen, not removed, packed. As though my life had quietly become transitional property. What exactly did you tell people? Laura exhaled shakily. We were trying to prepare everyone. Prepare everyone. The sentence chilled me instantly. For what? Another pause, then softly, in case things progress quickly. Things, not aging, not grief, things. I lowered my voice carefully. There is nothing wrong with my memory. You forgot Ethan's school concert. I had pneumonia. You repeat stories. Everyone repeats stories. You seem confused lately. Examples. I wanted examples. But suddenly I realized something terrible. It did not matter. Because once someone begins collecting ordinary human mistakes as evidence, they can always find more. I walked slowly into Richard's office while holding the phone. The filing cabinet drawer was open slightly. Inside, folders had clearly been rearranged. Property documents, insurance papers, bank statements. Laura had been through everything. What were you looking for? I asked quietly. Silence again. Too long, then. Mom, maybe you shouldn't live alone anymore. There it was. Not concern, direction, the shape of the future they were already building around me. And suddenly I understood the most terrifying part. My daughter had not only been telling people I was moving. She had already started preparing the world for my disappearance from my own life. That night, I searched the entire house. Not dramatically, carefully, room by room, drawer by drawer. Closet by closet. At first, I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe Laura really had only been organizing. But once I started looking closely, the pattern became impossible to ignore. 3 photo albums missing from the hallway cabinet. Richard's military photograph gone. 2 crystal glasses from the dining room hutch missing entirely. Tax folders rearranged inside the office. And perhaps worst of all, the empty spaces themselves. Little absences you only notice when you know a home deeply enough. I suddenly realized something painful. Someone can erase parts of your life very quietly if they move slowly enough. At around 10, my son Daniel called. Interesting. Laura had obviously contacted him immediately. Hey Mom, careful voice again, always careful now. You went through my house. Silence, then softly, we were helping Laura clean. Helping, always helping. You removed personal belongings. You don't use most of that stuff anymore. The sentence hit harder than I expected, not because of the objects themselves. Because suddenly my attachment to my own life had become negotiable. Where is your father's photograph? Another pause, then, it's safe. Safe, such a dangerous word, not returned, not untouched. Safe as opposed to what? Daniel sighed heavily. Mom, nobody's attacking you. I laughed softly. You told the neighborhood I moved away. That wasn't the point. Then what was the point? Silence again. Too much silence lately. Finally, we're trying to prepare for transitions. Transitions. Another harmless word hiding something enormous underneath. What transitions? You can't stay here forever. There it was. Not possibility, assumption. I walked slowly through the kitchen while holding the phone. This is my home. For now. The room went completely still. For now, not if, when. My chest tightened painfully. You already decided I'm leaving. No one decided anything, but you packed boxes. We were organizing ahead. Ahead, always ahead, the future again. Fear lives comfortably inside future planning because it sounds responsible. I lowered my voice carefully. What exactly have you told people about me? Daniel hesitated. That you've been struggling lately. Struggling with what? Memory, isolation, grief. There it was, a narrative, not one lie, many small interpretations arranged together. Memory, isolation. Grief, three ordinary human experiences transformed slowly into evidence of decline. After we hung up, I stood alone in the dark kitchen, listening to the refrigerator hum softly. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. 2 weeks earlier, Laura insisting, "You should really let us start handling more things." At the time, I thought she meant chores. Now I wondered how much larger that sentence really was. The next morning, I drove directly to Laura's house. Not planned, not emotional, necessary. When she opened the door, her expression changed, instantly seeing my face. "Mom, I want my things back," she blinked. "What? Everything you removed from my house?" Laura looked genuinely exhausted, dark circles beneath her eyes, hands trembling slightly. Fear had been consuming her too. "We only packed a few things." "What things?" "Things we thought might get damaged later." Damaged, interesting, not unnecessary, not clutter, damaged. As though my house already belonged to some uncertain future, I stepped inside without waiting for permission. The first thing I saw was the box, sitting directly beside the dining room wall. My handwriting on the side in black marker, "Richard's office." My stomach turned cold. I walked toward it slowly. "Laura," she looked terrified now. "Mom, please listen." I opened the box. Inside sat Richard's photograph. His journals, old insurance papers, family albums, pieces of my life packed away like estate property, not memories, inventory. I looked up slowly. "You packed my husband into a storage box." Laura started crying immediately, real crying, ashamed crying. "We thought it would make things easier later." Later, always later. "What exactly is later?" She covered her face briefly. "When you move." "Not if." "When." I sat down slowly at the kitchen table because suddenly my legs felt weak. "You already chose a place for me." Silence. Then softly, "We were looking." Looking, God help me. They had already started searching for somewhere else for me to live, without telling me. Laura sat across from me carefully. "You've been struggling alone." "I live alone, that's different." "You seem overwhelmed lately." "Your father died." "That was years ago." Again. That same sentence, repeated so often it almost sounded institutional. I stared at my daughter carefully. "Do you know what's happening to you?" She blinked through tears. "What? You stopped seeing me as a person." The room went silent. "You see a future problem now." Laura shook her head desperately. "No." "Yes." I pointed toward the box. "You packed my life while I was out of town. We thought starting slowly would help the transition." Transition. Again, not conversation, not choice, transition. Like my removal from my own home had already become a process underway. Then, Laura quietly admitted something that made my blood run cold. The assisted living coordinator said gradual adjustment is easier emotionally. Coordinator, assisted living, my entire body went still. "You already spoke to a facility." Long silence. Then, just preliminary discussions. Preliminary discussions. The phrase nearly made me laugh from disbelief. My children had already started discussing my relocation with strangers, while I still watered my own garden and paid my own bills independently every month. I looked toward the packed box again. Richard's photograph stared back at me from beneath old folders, and suddenly I understood something terrifying. The moving truck was never about helping organize the house. It was rehearsal. A small practice run to see how easily pieces of my life could disappear before anyone questioned it. I brought the box home myself, not because it was heavy, because I needed to carry it. I needed to feel the weight of what they had already started doing behind my back. Laura stood silently in the doorway while I loaded everything into my trunk. She kept trying to speak, trying to explain, but explanations sounded meaningless now. By the time I reached home, rain had started again. I carried Richard's photograph back inside first, then the albums, then the papers. Restoring the house felt strangely ceremonial, like reclaiming territory after strangers passed through it. I placed Richard's photograph carefully back above the fireplace. The familiar sight nearly made me cry from relief, not because it was just a picture, because it belonged there. That was what my children no longer understood. A home is not furniture and paperwork. It is accumulated memory arranged physically around a life. Once people begin organizing your life for you, they begin reorganizing your identity too. That evening, my grandson Ethan called unexpectedly. Not Laura, not Daniel, Ethan. Grandma. His small voice immediately softened something inside me. Hi, sweetheart. Mom's crying. I closed my eyes briefly. I know. Silence, then quietly. Are you really moving away? There it was. The children already knew too. Or at least enough to become frightened. No, I said carefully. I'm staying home. Another pause. But Mom said the doctors think you shouldn't live alone. Doctors, interesting. Now there were doctors too. What doctors? I don't know. His voice lowered slightly. She said your memory's getting worse. There it was again. Memory, always memory, never specific problems. Never actual evidence, just memory. I suddenly realized something terrifying. The narrative had already spread beyond the family. Neighbors, children, doctors, facilities. Little by little, my future removal from my own life was becoming socially accepted before I even knew it existed. Ethan, I asked softly, do you think I forget people? No, the answer came instantly, not hesitant, not careful, just honest. Then he added quietly, but Mom says sometimes people don't notice when they're changing. The sentence hit me like ice water, because that was the perfect trap. Any disagreement automatically became denial. I sat silently for a moment. Then Ethan whispered, I don't want you to leave your house. Neither did I. After we hung up, I walked slowly through the living room again. Everything suddenly looked fragile, not physically, institutionally. Because I finally understood how easily systems can begin surrounding older people once families express enough concern. The next morning, Susan came over carrying coffee and fury. I showed her everything. The packed boxes, the assisted living brochures I found in Laura's trunk accidentally, the notes from the facility coordinator. Susan read the brochure twice before looking up at me in disbelief. They toured places already? Yes, without me, without even asking me. Susan sat heavily on the couch. This is insane. The word nearly relieved me physically. Not my reactions, not my emotions, the situation. I told her about Ethan's phone call too, the doctors, the memory decline conversations. Susan's expression darkened instantly. They're building consensus. Consensus, exactly, not one accusation. Shared certainty growing quietly through repetition. She keeps saying you're changing, Susan muttered bitterly. I stared down at the brochure in my hands, smiling older couples, gardens, comfortable apartments. The language made my skin crawl. Transition support, memory-friendly environment, future planning assistance. Everything sounded compassionate. That was what frightened me most. Control wrapped in kindness becomes very difficult to challenge without sounding unreasonable. At noon, Daniel arrived unexpectedly. Again. The family rotated around me, now like caseworkers managing a situation, instead of children visiting their mother. The moment he stepped inside and saw Susan there, his expression tightened. Maybe this isn't helping, always helping. Susan stood immediately. No. What isn't helping is secretly packing her belongings while discussing facilities behind her back. Daniel rubbed his forehead tiredly. You don't understand. There's nothing to understand, Susan snapped. She's perfectly capable of living independently. Daniel looked toward me carefully. Mom, when was the last time you balanced the checkbook yourself? I blinked. What? The checkbook? I use online banking. Exactly. The sentence stunned me. As though adapting to technology somehow counted as evidence. You forgot your electric bill in April. I paid it 2 days late. You forgot. Forgot. Such a tiny word, such a dangerous one. I suddenly realized they had been keeping score quietly for months. Every late payment, every repeated story, every missed detail. Small imperfections transformed slowly into a case. Daniel lowered his voice carefully. You nearly left the stove on last winter. I stared at him. The burner was off. You thought it was on. The room went silent. Because suddenly I understood something horrifying. Even my fears had become evidence. I laughed softly, brokenly. So now anxiety itself is cognitive decline. No one said that. No. They never needed to say things directly anymore. The implication did all the work. Susan crossed her arms tightly. Did either of you ever stop to consider grief might affect memory slightly? Daniel looked exhausted. Dad's been gone 4 years. Again, that same sentence. Repeated so often, it no longer sounded emotional. It sounded diagnostic. Then Daniel quietly admitted something that made my stomach turn. The facility advisor said transitions work best before severe decline begins. The room went completely still. Facility advisor, not hypothetical anymore. Real conversations, real planning. Real timelines. I looked at my son carefully. You already chose a timeline for removing me from my home. No one's removing you, but you already packed boxes. Silence. That silence told the truth again. Then Susan asked the question I think none of them wanted spoken aloud. What happens if she refuses? Daniel looked away immediately. And suddenly, I understood the terrifying part. They had already discussed that possibility too. After Daniel left, Susan locked the front door and stood silently in the hallway for a long moment. Then she turned toward me slowly. You need legal protection. The sentence sounded dramatic at first. Then I looked around my own living room. Packed boxes, facility brochures. Family discussions happening without me. No, not dramatic. Necessary. The next morning, Susan drove me to meet Elaine Porter, the same attorney who handled Richard's estate years earlier. The moment Elaine finished reading the assisted living brochures and the handwritten notes from the facility coordinator, her expression hardened immediately. Did you authorize any relocation planning? No. Any power of attorney? No. Any medical evaluation confirming incapacity? No. Elaine leaned back slowly. Then your children are operating almost entirely on anticipated decline. Anticipated decline. Exactly. Not reality. Projection. Fear stretched into the future until it started shaping the present. I handed her the brochure again. They already toured places. Elaine nodded grimly. That concerns me deeply. Concern. Interesting hearing the word used correctly for once, not weaponized. Not disguised, real concern. She opened a legal pad slowly. Mrs. Carter, I need to ask something difficult. All right. Have your children gained access to financial accounts? My stomach tightened immediately. Daniel helping with online banking after Richard died. Laura organizing paperwork after my car accident. I'm not sure. Elaine's expression darkened slightly. That uncertainty itself is dangerous. The sentence stayed with me all afternoon, because suddenly I realized something terrible. My children had slowly trained me to question my own certainty. Not intentionally, perhaps, but effectively. Elaine continued carefully. What usually begins as family concern can escalate very quickly once institutions become involved. Institutions. There it was again. Not only family anymore. Facilities, advisors, coordinators. Systems quietly gathering around the possibility that I no longer fully belonged to myself. At around 3 that afternoon, Laura arrived unexpectedly. Again, the family no longer visited casually. They monitored. The moment she saw Elaine sitting in the kitchen, she froze. You hired a lawyer. I hired someone willing to ask for evidence before planning my removal from my home. Laura flinched visibly. Elaine remained calm. Your mother retains full legal autonomy. Of course she does, Laura said quickly. Too quickly. Because deep down, she had already started imagining a future where that might not remain true. Laura sat down carefully across from us. Nobody's trying to take Mom's independence. Elaine folded her hands calmly. Then why were assisted living consultations happening without her knowledge? Silence. Then softly, we were preparing early. Preparing, always preparing. Future fear disguised as responsibility. Laura looked toward me desperately. You've changed. I almost laughed from exhaustion. What exactly does that mean now? You seem overwhelmed. Richard died. That was years ago, again. That same sentence, repeated so often it no longer sounded like grief had an expiration date. It sounded like evidence. Elaine interrupted gently. Mrs. Bennett, has your mother ever failed to manage bills independently? No. Ever wandered away from home? No. Ever failed formal cognitive testing? She hasn't been tested yet. Exactly. No evidence, only anticipation. Elaine nodded slowly. So currently what exists is fear, not incapacity. Laura's eyes filled immediately. You think I'm crazy? No, Elaine said softly. I think you're frightened enough to mistake possibility for certainty. The room went silent, because somewhere deep down, everyone knew it was true. Laura covered her face briefly. When Dad got sick, her voice shook. Everything changed so fast. Richard again, always Richard. I suddenly understood something painful. My children were not only afraid of losing me. They were terrified of being unprepared the way they felt unprepared for his cancer. Fear had rewritten the past until vigilance became morality. I promised myself I'd never ignore warning signs again, Laura whispered. There it was. The origin, not greed, not cruelty, trauma. Susan crossed her arms tightly. That still doesn't justify secretly packing her belongings. No, Laura whispered, and for the first time she sounded uncertain, not defensive, not careful, ashamed. Then she quietly admitted something that made my blood run cold. The facility coordinator suggested gradual transitions. Transition again, not relocation, not removal, transition. As in moving my belongings before I even agreed to leave, Laura started crying immediately. She said sudden changes confuse elderly residents emotionally. Residents, not mother, not person. Resident, I stared at my daughter in disbelief. You already started speaking about me like I belonged there. No, but the panic in her voice only confirmed it further. The language had already changed inside her mind. Elaine looked directly at Laura. Do you understand how dangerous this becomes once older adults stop being treated as reliable narrators of their own lives? Laura said nothing, because that was exactly what had started happening. Not dramatically, quietly, a missed bill, a repeated story, a late payment, a car accident. Tiny human moments gathered together until my own voice slowly mattered less than everyone else's interpretation of me. At around 6, my phone rang. Mrs. Langley, my neighbor. I answered immediately. Margaret, I hope this isn't inappropriate, but another truck came today while you were gone. The room went completely silent. What? I told them you hadn't moved yet. Them, not Laura alone. I stood up so quickly my chair nearly fell backward. Who was there? Your son and 2 movers. My chest turned cold. Another truck, another rehearsal, or perhaps no longer rehearsal at all. I looked toward Laura slowly, her face drained completely. You sent movers to my house again, she looked horrified. I didn't know Daniel was doing that today. Today. Meaning there had already been schedules, plans, timelines. I suddenly realized something terrifying. This process had continued moving forward even while they apologized to me. Because once systems and plans begin organizing around older people, momentum becomes frighteningly difficult to stop. I drove home faster than I should have. Rain blurred across the windshield, while my heart pounded so hard it hurt. Not because I thought Daniel was stealing furniture. Because suddenly, I understood something terrifying. My children had started treating my house like a temporary location instead of my home. When I pulled into the driveway, the moving truck was still there. 2 men stood near the porch carrying empty boxes while Daniel argued quietly with Mrs. Langley beside the mailbox. The moment he saw my car, his face changed instantly. Not surprise, fear, real fear. I stepped out slowly. What exactly is happening? Daniel rubbed his forehead tiredly. Mom, please calm down. Calm down, always calm down. As though emotion itself disqualified me from understanding reality. You hired movers. We were just reorganizing storage. Storage. Not packing, not removing. Storage. I walked past him directly into the house. The hallway closet doors stood open, several winter coats missing, boxes stacked near the staircase. My chest tightened painfully, then I saw it, the dining room wall. Empty. Richard's landscape painting was gone. I stopped breathing for a second. That painting mattered more to him than almost anything in the house. He bought it with his first military pension check nearly 30 years earlier. "Where is it?" Daniel looked exhausted. "We thought it might get damaged during transition later." Transition, again, always transition. I turned toward him slowly. "There is no transition." Silence. Then softly, "Mom, no." For the first time since this nightmare began, my voice sounded sharp enough to make everyone in the room freeze. No more careful voices, no more planning. No more pretending this is help. The movers exchanged awkward glances immediately. Mrs. Langley stood perfectly still beside the front door. Daniel lowered his voice. "You're overwhelmed right now." There it was again. Every emotional reaction translated automatically into instability. I laughed once softly, brokenly. My children hired movers behind my back and emptied parts of my home while telling the neighborhood I already relocated. Daniel said nothing. Because no careful wording could soften reality anymore, I walked slowly through the living room. Missing books, missing photographs, missing pieces of my life, not enough for strangers to notice. Enough for me. That was the frightening part. Older people do not lose autonomy all at once. Sometimes it disappears object by object while everyone insists they are helping. Then Daniel quietly admitted something that hollowed me completely. The facility expected partial transition this month. Facility, expected. My legs suddenly felt weak. "You gave them a timeline." Silence. That silence told me enough. Weeks, maybe months. Plans moving quietly forward while I still believed my children merely worried about me. "Mrs. Langley finally spoke carefully from the doorway. "Margaret, should I call someone?" The question hung heavily in the room. Someone, police, lawyers, doctors. I suddenly realized how dangerous perception had become. If I appeared too emotional now, would I look unstable? If I stayed calm, would they interpret it as resignation? There was no safe reaction anymore. Elaine arrived 20 minutes later. Susan must have called her immediately. The moment she stepped inside and saw the movers, the boxes, and the missing furniture, her expression darkened instantly. "What authority was used to arrange this?" Daniel looked exhausted. "We were preparing gradually." "Answer the question." Silence. Then, "No formal authority." Exactly, no diagnosis. No incapacity, no consent, just momentum. Elaine turned toward the movers calmly. "You need to leave immediately." They left within minutes. Not because they understood the situation fully, because suddenly the room no longer looked like compassionate family planning. It looked dangerous. That distinction mattered. After everyone else left, only Daniel remained standing silently in the living room. Rain tapped softly against the windows. The empty dining room wall looked unbearable. Finally, he whispered, "I thought easing you into it would hurt less." Ease me into it, as though my life already belonged to some unavoidable future. I stared at my son for a long time, then quietly asked the question haunting me since this nightmare began. "When exactly did you stop seeing this house as mine?" Daniel's eyes filled immediately. Not anger, not defensiveness. Shame, real shame. I don't know. And somehow I believed him. That was the tragedy. Nobody woke up planning to erase me. Fear carried them there slowly. Fear of emergencies. Fear of regret. Fear of waiting too long. Until eventually my children stopped interacting with me directly and started interacting with the possibility of future decline instead. Over the next month, everything unraveled quietly. The facility consultations stopped. The moving plans disappeared. The boxes returned. Elaine drafted formal legal protections, ensuring no relocation or medical intervention could occur without direct, independent evaluation and consent. That mattered enormously to me. Not because I expected betrayal again, because autonomy should never depend entirely on family interpretation. Laura apologized first, not dramatically, quietly. One afternoon, she came over carrying Richard's painting wrapped carefully in blankets. The moment she handed it to me, she burst into tears. "I don't know how this got so far." I did. Fear. Fear always travels farther than people expect once institutions begin reinforcing it. Laura sat in the kitchen for nearly 2 hours afterward, admitting everything slowly. The facility advisor, the transitions specialist, the discussions about preparing early before serious decline. Every person involved sounded compassionate. That was what frightened me most. Nobody sounded cruel while slowly removing my independence. They sounded responsible. Months passed. Life settled again gradually. The neighbors stopped whispering. No more moving trucks. No more careful conversations about memory. But some damage remained permanently. Last week, I misplaced my keys for nearly 20 minutes. The moment Laura saw me searching the kitchen counters, fear flashed across her face automatically. Just for a second, but I saw it, and she saw me seeing it. The silence afterward hurt more than any argument we ever had, because fear leaves habits behind. Eventually, she laughed shakily and said, "Maybe people just lose keys sometimes." I smiled. Because finally, after everything, my daughter was learning something important again. Human beings are allowed to be imperfect without becoming projects. Yesterday evening, I stood alone in the dining room rehanging Richard's painting carefully back onto the wall. The nail hole remained exactly where it always had been. Like the house itself had been waiting for someone to stop preparing for my disappearance long enough to remember I was still here. And perhaps that is the most terrifying thing about growing older. Sometimes people become so afraid of losing you someday, they slowly begin removing pieces of your life long before you are actually gone.